Hello, my name's Gina Clifford, and I'm here with Louise Mowbray, and together we are in conversation. And today we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence. And we'll kick it off with Louise. I'd like to ask you a question. Since you are a leadership coach, what are your thoughts on how leadership is being impacted by artificial intelligence? How do you see that playing out in the next year or so?
Yeah, it's so interesting, Gina, because I work with such a variety of different leadership teams and leaders themselves. And of course, I think that they're feeling very much the same as most people. If we sort of look broadly at the press, people don't know quite what to think. Some organizations, some C-suite teams are deeply involved, and I like you am involved in futures too. So very much working at looking at the implications of AI, what it means for their businesses, looking at a much sort of longer term picture than we might have seen. So that, of course, short, medium, long term. I think we've been very short termist in recent years, and we probably needed to be because we've been dealing with one major shift and change after the other. And I mean, the extraordinary thing is, if we think about it in real terms, we've had three seismic shifts in the last three and a bit years. It started with a pandemic, and as if that wasn't enough, of course, then we had Russia's war in Ukraine, and that threw our supply chains again into disarray, and a food crisis, and all of the other knock-on effects around energy. And of course, ChatGPT was launched at the end of November last year. And I think that a lot of organizations use AI already, quite, liberally throughout their organizations and in their applications and what have you. But this changed the game. And leaders have definitely realized that it's no longer, another shiny new app strapped onto an old system. It's a new system. And the pace, intensity, and nature of change that we're experiencing today will only accelerate. So I think a lot of leaders and organizations who perhaps, I'm not going to say were lackadaisical, but perhaps, we're trundling along and, getting on with things at kind of a normal pace, have suddenly had to sit back and take a look at what does this actually mean, and look at developing a stance within their organizations around ethics. And then, of course, there are a lot of organizations that haven't. It's almost as if we're sort of sitting on the sidelines, either as passive critics or accidental tourists. And you and I know, as futurists, we're either in action of creating the future and having some agency over that, or not. And I guess therein lies the choice. But I'll throw it back at you. What are you seeing?
Yes, I think we talked about it earlier, where we're looking at ChatGPT and we're comparing it to human intelligence. And I think that is actually the wrong approach because it looks and talks like us, right? We can make images that look like they're humans, so they're made by AIs. And the language learning it's getting very good. So some of these chatbots can actually speak to us in natural language. We may not even realize that it's a human. It's not a human, but where that similarity ends is that how these AIs learn and are trained, they're completely different than the way humans think and learn, and so they are not going to necessarily have the same actions that we would have. They may have the same language, which is kind of a mistake for us to think they're thinking, feeling, emotional beings of some sort, and they're going to have those empathetic reactions. But in reality, they may not. They may, but they may not. So they're governed by a set of different algorithms that do things that we didn't expect. So we don't think we should compare ourselves against AI, and I think we should say, how can AI be used to help us in the world? What can we do to make ourselves faster, better, stronger in any of the things that we endeavor to do? And there's amazing tools. The ChatGPT is an amazing tool in it as of itself. The problems with that we see with it always point back to the data. So whatever data that we're putting into the machines, we're getting the results out. And if we put data that's biased, and we've both talked about bias, I think there are several good books out there that talk about the actual bias that already exists even before artificial intelligence in everything in the world. The data, I think, was Invisible Women was one, Caroline Perez, and there's another one called Discriminating Data by Wendy Chung, and they both talk about the vast majority of data being collected is white, male, biased, to the point where in most cases it's default male. And if you're looking at a female case for something, it's just a smaller version of male. But we all know that uh, genetically we are pretty different than each other. So I think that we need to take AI in a different context, and we need to think about it as separate, not has how it's similar to us, but what it is of itself, and how we can work with it, and what look at the dangers. Think mostly the dangers that we are going to face are dangers that we allow it to do things, to think for us, to do things for us without question and without concern and without an ethics uh, panel or some kind of human intervention to filter out any kind of unexpected, undesirable consequences. But I mean that's a rabbit hole, and I think we could continue talking about that, but I think we could also talk about what we can do to make sure that doesn't get to the point where we're all relying on it blindly. And I think that was when we started talking about the humanities and the arts and education and where does that fit in. And what are your thoughts on how those kinds of things, the humanities and the arts, and how our education is shaped, how can that help us have a healthier relationship with AI moving forward? Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you touched on something earlier, Gina. Talking about how little data there is on all of our diversity of populations. And I think it's interesting when we talk about humanities or human, because when it comes to AI, it means man. It doesn't mean, all of humankind. So I think that the best way to deal with anything is to learn about it and to understand exactly, as you said, how we can use it to benefit our societies. And education is so interesting. I mean, it was one of the first things that people got super excited about. And, our education systems, well, that's it. We'll never know if somebody's actually learned something or not. But what is learning? Is it learning by rote and producing something from memory in an exam? Does that show understanding? Does it show meaning? And I think that if we think about how our systems are designed, ultimately, perhaps this is forcing us to take a look at the systems that we have accepted as part and parcel of the fabric of our society for so long. I mean, if we look at education systems, they were designed typically in the 50s by 50-year-old white men at the time.
Yes.
And the issue with that is that they've been falling short of preparing people for this world that we're in today, and certainly what's coming for a long time now. And I know that there's been a lot of discussion around it. And maybe this, look, I mean, I'm probably always going to try and find the good in everything, but that's just my nature. But perhaps what this might do is put a fire under all of us to ensure that the systems that, instead of just strapping new applications or shiny new apps on a system that is quite obviously not suited for what's happening today and what's coming, and doesn't necessarily prepare people for the world that we're living in, as well as it might have done, in the times it was designed, is, perhaps it's going to push us to look at a redesign. But, things that are rooted in in history, with all of their nuances and adopted everywhere, are really slow to move. So I think it will be down to each individual parent to think about the world that they are creating. I mean, it sounds, it almost sounds futile. How can any one of us move the needle on anything? However, if there are enough people thinking the same thing, then of course, then we have the collective power. But it's, I think, really down to parents to think about their world, what they're dealing with, what's actually going on, and how best to prepare their children. And it was kind of interesting. I think we both listened to the same interview between Mo Gaudat from the ex-Google chap um, who I think his mission in life is to his moonshot is to create what is it?
A
1 billion happy people.
people, yes.
Apart from, of course, his understanding and deep experience in technology and AI and everything related to that. And of course, Peter is it Diamandis? I always mispronounce his name, from Singularity. And the discussion around, we need to treat AI as we might treat a child, as we might help a child to grow up. And I think when I think of education, I think of children, I think of young people, but of course, we're also thinking of ourselves. How do we need to upskill and reskill so that we are prepared for what is here and what's coming? By all accounts, and there's been some great research and papers around this, we will experience more change in the next 10 years around all of the sciences, technology, society, and the environment than we have done in the last 100 years. And that's I would say that before the end of November last year, I kind of took it as a factoid, something that's kind of interesting, and, we better get our skates on and make sure we're better prepared. But since ChatGPT opened the door to large language models and generative AI and its ability to learn from us and converse in a human-like, I mean, I need so many inverted commas whenever I'm talking about AI, because, as you rightly said, we often attribute very human qualities to it, and yet it's nothing like that. But it can feel like that. It can appear to be like that. So, yeah, very roundabout answer to your question, but it always takes me on a bit of, but it takes me down a bit of a rabbit hole, because everything's interconnected. And of course, until we are actively involved in creating the way that we want to live, I think now we have, in terms of threat, and I'd love to talk to you about, to hear your thoughts around, existential threat, which is, of course, what the media has picked up on, and we can get into that in a minute. But, anything around that, is that real and present? And I would say yes. However, we absolutely have the opportunity to do something about it now. And I'll pass that beautiful existential threat question back to you.
Well, yes. I mean, Ian Bremmer, I think it was last month, his article was the cover of Time magazine, The End of Humanity. And in the word humanity, A and I are highlighted and bolded, so it stands out as he's going to talk about how AI is the end of humanity. And he's also written the book, The Power of Crises. And he covers 3 existential threats for humanity: the pandemic, global climate change, and of course, artificial intelligence. And I don't think he attacks AI as much as he does the politics and the people that are using it, weaponizing it, as if you will, for this against their citizenry in ways that we haven't seen before. And he points to how in China, the Chinese government officials used AI basically to racially profile a group of people to control them in the way that they wanted to control, and how they might be exporting that kind of thinking and model and technology to other countries around the world that they're working through their Belt and Road program. So those are some of the threats that he points out to. It's not just the technology, it's in the hands of people who really have some really dark ideas about controlling humanity. and how that might take root. So I think that that's, you have to consider that. And also, I listened to, I think it was a National Public Radio interview recently with Terry Gross, and she interviewed a journalist that had worked with like ChatGPT and such. And they kind of talked about how AI actually learns and how it looks and it can speak like us, but it makes unpredictable decisions. And sometimes they call that hallucinations, where it makes wrong inferences or it gives you wrong information. And the scary thing about that in that interview was that in one scenario in the future, you might query or just command your AI assistant to go out and make you some money. And this AI, being algorithm based, will do everything it has to do to successfully complete that command, right? It will just work until it finishes the job. And this journalist said, theorists are saying, well, if it's just using logic and it doesn't have enough empathy, it might do illegal things to try to make that money for you. And that might include fraud, it might include theft, and it might include murder. So that's another way people are seeing that left unchecked, technology left to its own, if it gets ahead of our ethics, could end up being pretty bad news for people. But the good thing about this whole scenario is that we have the Gen Z generation coming into the workforce now, and they don't think as much as you can stereotype a group. Of course, there are individuals that don't necessarily follow along with this, but as a group that have been surveyed and interviewed, looking at what their decisions that those young people are making right now in the workplaces, they're not they're not okay with the status quo. They want work-life balance. They want real connections with people. They want to enjoy their lives. They want to figure out who they are and have much more meaning in their lives. They want climate change to go away. They want to have life that in a world that's beautiful and safe and not overwhelmingly hot and dangerous, right? So these are young people that are going to be shaping our future, their future. AI is part of that. What will they do with AI? If I had to guess right now, I would say, based on the other things that they're doing, they're probably going to take AI and make sure that it serves them and not the opposite. So I'm kind of optimistic because I see the future young people coming into the world being much more thoughtful about what humanity means and what it means to be a being on Earth, and not just doing it for the money, doing it because I need a job, but doing it because I want to, and I'm willing to make less money to have a more meaningful life. And I think AI will fit perfectly into that because if you look on the bright side of technology, and this is where I would like your thoughts too, what you've seen, but already, people are saying that it can be used in medicine to find cures for rare diseases and things that humanity just hasn't had the resources to investigate. So used in humanity's service, AI could be an incredible partner that like we've never seen before and could make our lives, all of our lives, in many ways, much, much better if we use it responsibly and in ways that serve us. But yeah, I'd like to turn it back over to you and if you have thoughts on ways that you're seeing AI being a positive for the world.
Yeah, I think that, in all of the, of course, when we're sort of had this unbelievable push by the media for sort of, incredible headlines that are enough to frighten us to death, and you're looking for clicks and likes and shares because there's advertising revenue associated with it. Of course, we know that bad news sells better than good news. So I think that we're not giving enough airtime to the really extraordinary things that can be achieved. And so many great things have happened already. I mean, of course, you just touched on things like medicine, and um, there, even if we just simply look at um, our use of technology in terms of delivering medicines, and now how our large language models are being integrated with some of the robotics that we're using at the moment, and of course, all of that will only grow. Then I think there's just an extraordinary amount of good that can be done. And you're absolutely right. I think young people are totally focused on that. I've got some amazing young people in my life who are very much either studying this or they're getting very involved in this in some way, shape, or form. And the beautiful thing is that we've asked them to be like that. We took them out as young people, picking up rubbish and cleaning up rivers and doing all of these wonderful, societally rich things. And we shouldn't be surprised by their complete disappointment in the eras that went before them. I mean, how could we leave a planet in this state for them? I often hear that kind of rhetoric. But the solutions that are coming out of it are awe-inspiring. And the tools that they have today in order to be able to solve problems that we just have not been able to figure out is extraordinary. Often I just think of every single extraordinary advancement in science and technology we celebrate, but there is always a human cost. And often we have no idea what that cost will be until sometime in the future. So with every development, every great leap, we are creating systemic issues where we have no idea what those issues will be until they reveal themselves in time to come. And then, the extraordinary thing about human ingenuity and the optimism bias that apparently we all have, according to researchers, kind of kicks in, and we find solutions to what we're dealing with. Sometimes I think of plastics, simple things like plastics. I don't know if your parents, your mother ever had Tupperware, your grandmother ever had Tupperware parties. But of course, when household plastics were first discovered, it was kind of the invention of the era. And little did we know that would be, single-use plastics would become the norm. And we've just wrapped everything in plastic ever since. And we now pump about 14 billion tons worth of plastic into the oceans every single month. And with that, we've got some extraordinary young people who are using AI together with engineering and all sorts of other technologies to actually, produce solutions to issues that we just haven't been able to stop the use of plastics, and we certainly haven't been able to actually clean up our oceans and rivers. And I have great faith in human nature. And I can remember being young. I mean, I definitely, every young person needs to be a revolutionary. We need to kick back against what is and find better ways forward. So, yeah, for me, that's about, the sort of physiology of different ages. And, I celebrate it. That's what we need to be doing. And I think the other thing is that, of course, when we were studying or, much younger, dare I say, we didn't have these technologies at our disposal, and we certainly didn't have the awareness that we have today. The world has changed enormously in terms of connectivity. It's probably the greatest change for all of us the world over. And even if you are sitting in a country where typically, the average person doesn't get outside news or platforms or what have you, people find a way. So I think that people are innately curious. And the other thing is that, there's this sort of anti-fragility, which I think is kind of finally getting some air as people realize that we need to be a little bit more robust. And, not every little thing that comes along can sort of sway us from our sort of determination to build and have a decent life and to do the same for others. And I'm starting to see a bit more of that kicking in, because there was a stage that we sort of, certainly we get a lot of calls from sort of C-suite executives where the big question was, how do we get these people involved? How do we get millennials to work? How do we, inspire them to actually have the same sort of work ethic that we've had? And yet, I think we're starting to see sort of a shift around that, and a sort of innate understanding that they operate, in a different way, and their priorities are perhaps not the same as the era that came before them.
Yeah, I think, and I'm hopeful that this happens because of what you just said. The idea of embracing history, the humanities, and the arts at this particular stage right now that we're in, facing artificial intelligence and its ability to emulate us in artistic ways as well, whether that's written, vocal, musical, or graphic arts and moving pictures. So there's that existential threat of human output being replaced by AI. But what you just said about the Gen Zs coming with a different perspective, wanting balance, wanting authenticity and real connection, I think it's important to embrace not only that generation's thinking, but also the idea of, gee, even if something can recreate this, the way humans seek out connectivity with other humans, and I think you said that earlier, we seek connections with other people. And it's the artistic expression of people that touches our souls in a way that we don't even consciously recognize. And I think that AI might sometimes get lucky and hit that, but more often than not, it's going to start to feel like it all looks the same because it's derivative. It's derivative. That's the best word I could say. When I look at it, and even the audio that I've heard, it's still very derivative. It'll get better, and maybe eventually it will figure out how to put those little breaths and the little ahs in there that make us imperfect, but ultimately human and much more interesting to listen to because we're authentic. So,
Well,
yeah,
something I've got to add to that there, if you
well,
don't mind me interrupting you. Yeah, I've been, as you know, I've been writing a lot lately, and I was trying to figure out a way of not totally exhausting myself in terms of putting it into audio, And so I've been exploring cloning my voice with AI, and there is an explosion of apps that are able to actually clone your voice together with the breaths, and that's what caught my attention. So I think all of this is just moving so fast, Gina, and I'd love to hear more. I know that you've been talking to some people in the media and artistic expression. I'm not entirely sure how we can kind of blanket umbrella name that creatives, let's say, perhaps.
yes,
And I have too. And I know you mentioned something about people's perspective about how ultimately creatives are not that threatened by AI. And I mean, we've also seen things like the Beatles finding an old recording of John Lennon's voice and producing a song which is rumored to be published sometime this year. So, yes, I mean, what are your thoughts around that? What have you learned?
yeah. So the people that I've spoken with aren't really that threatened by AI. Honestly, I think maybe there's a question of what that means if you're a musician in the future. But I think one perspective that was really interesting to me is that they look at AI as being a genre, just like it other genres of music. There'll be AI generated music, and there will be real applications for that. Perhaps when you're making a movie and you're a independent filmmaker and you don't have big budget, you can't afford to hire a composer or a person and spend the time to wait for that piece to be composed and scored for your movie. You might have an AI generated voice, I mean, not voice, but audio track that will sound perfectly fine and fill the bill completely, pretty quickly. But I think you'll the perspectives that I've heard from, there's always going to be a place for the human, and there's going to be great demand and even probably a premium on human generated content because it is something so, like I said, we connect viscerally with sound and voice and with creativity and artists' ability to pull that out of themselves and put that, and then we hear it and see it and we see ourselves reflected in it. There's something really visceral about that. So that one perspective is that there'll always be demand and maybe even greater demand. So it could actually catapult artists to a greater status than they are today. And another perspective was from a creative director that basically it doesn't really matter what technology comes along, that humanity is ultimately innately creative. We are, you know, destined to put stuff out there just because we're expressing ourselves as people, as humans. And we'll always do that regardless if the market is there or not. There have been periods in humanity when art wasn't appreciated, but people still created art. And I think that even if we get to the worst case scenario and AI takes over 90% of the jobs of artists, people will still create. They may do something else for a living, but they will still create art. And so, at some point, even if it's in a distant future, there'll be a renaissance of human focused art. And art, when I say art, I mean music, written language, poetry, theater, you name it, art, the arts. So, from the perspective of people, we're resilient. They're in their thinking. They're, like you said, we are innately optimistic, and I think that that is a very strong signal that humanity isn't doomed to be overtaken by AI unless we want it to and let it, and we do nothing to stop it. But of course, we're human and we're out there creating every day. So of course, we're not letting it, and that's why I'm optimistic.
Yeah, that's a good reason to be optimistic. Yeah, I guess the question in my mind is, can AI, when it comes to anything creative, I don't know what else can I put it, umbrella can I put it under, but the question in my mind is, does this move me? In the same way that poetry might, or a piece of music, or what have you. And even listening to LPs, I mean, rather than digitally produced music, there's something about the atmosphere, and it's something, there's something deeply contextual about that. There's a richness to it
Yes,
that is incredibly moving, and I think that we are all seeking that. It makes me think of the blue zones in the world where people live the longest. They've got the largest number of centurions. And I think there are 5 different blue zones in the world. And, ultimately, one of the key things, probably the ultimate elixir in living a long and happy life, is human connection. And we can create that connection not only, with one another, but of course through the creative pursuits that we're involved in, whether it's music or poetry or film or whatever it might be. I think the thing that I noticed the other day, I was watching a short clip. I can't forget the platform, and it was a chap using robots to create some music. And it was sort of a one-armed robot, or 2 of them hitting a piano, and another one playing drums and guitar. And when I closed my eyes and listened to it, it didn't move me. And
yes,
I was prepared to be moved. So it was kind of curious. And um, I think that when we think of this, will we always create? Absolutely. I think that the desire to create is such an innate part of who we are. uh, I can't imagine life without it, in some shape or form. It adds to the richness of life. And I love what you said about, perhaps human produced creative stuff would have a premium, it'll be high value. And rather than perhaps listening or watching or, consuming something that doesn't really move us. I mean, right now, I think that the algorithms that are baked into our platforms, of course, run by AI, um, ultimately works to the beat of the drum, that anything that is shocking, anything that is, divisive, anything that, that gets more clicks, likes, and what have you. But I think we've also then got to look into what's actually going on in terms of, what I think of as feeding the hungry ghost, the addiction to screens and all of the
yes,
other impacts on our lives. And of course, when we talk about young people, in comparison to um, someone our age, perhaps, we're talking about people who've grown up on screens. And And that's a very different generation altogether than perhaps millennials who might be shifting into leadership roles as we speak, as the old guard starts shifting out and this new sort of era of young leaders comes in. And, almost if we look at it through the sort of generations, and I'm not so sure about the categorizing people into these generations because, it's something that has been an easy way to box label and stereotype people, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily true for all cultures the world round.
Right.
It's very much a sort of Western, Americanized, Western view of the world. But when we look at what we're playing with at the moment, it's quite extraordinary that we have people in business today, from perhaps your more senior level leaders, right the way through to the young people coming in today who one end of the spectrum are complete and utter sort of digital, what's the word for it, what's the term for it,
Digital natives.
digital natives, right? It's all they've ever known, right to the other end of people who can't type an email, and and everything in between. And I mean, it's quite an extraordinary time as the old guard shifts out. It's gone, so that different era, that the people who grew up on books and playing outside and all of that, in a way is has been moved out of our societal norm. So I'm very curious about what the next 5 years seems like a long time at the moment. I don't know about you, with so much change happening at such a pace, what seems like all the time. Um, I'm almost reluctant to even think that far ahead, and yet we must, because of course what's going on societally, environmentally, demands that we actually start thinking much bigger and much longer, um, in an interconnected way. So, Gina, if you had to leave us with one thought, I probably should have left you with the thought of optimism because it was a lovely place to end. What would you leave us with today?
Well, it goes back to something you were talking about, not being moved by robotic generated music. And I think the reason for that is if you've ever listened to a performer, I'll pick out Itzhak Perlman as a violinist, and you hear him play a song that all violinists aspire to play. And then if you go to YouTube, you can do this pretty quickly. You can pick a classical piece that Itzhak Perlman has played, and then listen to other versions of it. Now, they're all humans and they're all playing it. But if you notice one thing, if you listen carefully, you will notice that every single version, every single person plays it differently, slightly differently. In fact, people at Itzhak Perlman put their own spin on it. They'll take a breath longer between a pause, a pregnant pause between notes here or there, or they'll have a slightly different rhythm. Usually robots will play it exactly as it's written. It will be perfect technically, but it will lack that that artistic spin that someone like Itzhak Perlman puts on it. And so honestly, if you think about how humans do that in everything they do, whether it's writing, whether it's creating something artistic, or whether it's a thought that they have for an idea, an invention, or an approach, a process, we put our own human spin on it. And it's based on all of our lived experiences, our unique individual lived experiences. Nothing else can duplicate it or replicate it. Even AI is trained and intelligent and smart at facts and data and pulling things together, isn't going to create what we can create. It'll create something, but it'll never be unique like each of us can create. So honestly, the optimism there is that there will always be that ability. We won't lose anything. And it may challenge us to be a little bit more creative and innovative in the short term, but I think that's a good thing. And I think if we embrace our humanity and stop comparing ourselves against AI directly in things that really aren't a fair comparison because we're not equal in any way, then we can start to think of how AI can be used to augment our lifestyles and our livelihoods and ways of being and living in the world. And that's the kind of scenario that I want to create. And I feel like I have agency to create that. And everyone else that's listening should also have agency to create in the world and find ways to leverage AI to make their lives better. So if you have any final thoughts, I would be glad to hear them. But yeah, that's my
Yeah,
take on it.
that's a really good note to end on, Gina. I agree with you. And what we're going to do, which is pretty exciting, is we're going to be talking to people from across the sectors and hopefully around the world. Well, certainly that's what's lined up. And the idea is that we're going to be bringing people in and actually getting to hear from them about how they see AI in their industry sectors, what they're picking up, what they're understanding, what the concerns are, and what the extraordinary opportunities are. And I'm very much looking forward to doing that with you in the coming weeks and months. So pretty exciting.
Likewise. Thanks, Louise.
Yeah, thanks, Gina.